A few weeks ago, I made a video talking about Yu-Gi-Oh's earliest effect monsters. I looked at LOB as well as starter decks Yugi and Kaiba, and just went over all of the effect monsters that the game had at that point. Yu-Gi-Oh back in the day obviously looked very different from what we have nowadays, not only with the card pool like I explained in that video, but also in terms of the forbidden and limited list. In today's video, because I was really thinking about that older format, I wanted to go over the very first forbidden and limited list in the Yu-Gi-Oh TCG. Now this went into effect on May 1st, 2002, and at that point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, the only releases were LOB and starter decks Yugi and Kaiba, so we are looking at that exact same format from a few weeks ago, just in a different light. If you guys enjoy today's video, make sure to subscribe for more content and like the video if you liked the video. Anyway, without further ado, let's talk about Yu-Gi-Oh's very first forbidden and limited list. Now, one thing to note here is that this list actually doesn't have any forbidden cards. We wouldn't see any cards get forbidden until a few years later, but they did still call it the forbidden and limited list. They always let players know that there was an option for a card to be banned. Now, if you watched that video from a few weeks ago, this probably won't surprise you, but this forbidden and limited list really doesn't have that many monsters on it. There are 12 cards and only 5 of them are monsters, and you can probably guess what those 5 monsters are already. But if you remember back to that video, the effect monsters we were looking at really weren't that good. I mean, you did have some good ones, but nothing that was that broken, and back in the day at this point, most people's decks were filled with normal monsters, not effect monsters. So anyway, let's talk about the monsters that are limited. It is all 5 pieces of Exodia. I do not think that is a surprise to anyone. Exodia has been limited since day 1 in Yu-Gi-Oh, and it is still limited to this day. Now, I've talked about Exodia the Forbidden One and the pieces on the channel many times, and one of the things that I've always mentioned is that I do not think that these cards are limited because they would be too strong if they were semi or unlimited. In my opinion, the only reason that Exodia the Forbidden One is limited, and the only reason it has been limited this long, is because of lore reasons. Now that is pretty weird to say. I've talked about it in a video in the past, but yeah, I think that the only reason these cards are limited and have been limited for so long is because no one wants you to have multiple copies of Exodia pieces in your deck. I've even mentioned in the past how I don't think it would actually be better to play multiple copies of these cards, because then you risk drawing weird mismatched hands where you have like 3 copies of right arm and 2 copies of left arm. I think realistically Exodia players would only play the one single copy of all of them. Maybe they would play 3 copies of Exodia the Forbidden One, like the actual head, but in terms of the normal monster parts of this set of cards, I think people would only ever want to play 1 copy in their decks. I know there are some Exodia support cards that maybe would be better if you had more than 1 copy of the pieces, but I don't think those cards would be very competitive, so I'm not too worried about them. Regardless, Exodia the Forbidden One and all of its pieces were the only limited monsters on the very first forbidden and limited list. All of the other cards that were limited at this time were spells. We had no traps on here, and yeah, at the time they were called magic cards, not spell cards, but at this point we did not have many of the old school powerful trap cards. This would be before cards like Mere Force were released or Torrential Tribute were released, so we're only going to talk about spells for the rest of the video. Unsurprisingly, at this point, Change of Heart was limited. Nowadays, we can use this card a lot better than they could back then. We can steal a monster, kind of like how we use Mind Control, and use it for a Synchro summon or an Xyz summon or a Link summon or whatever. Back then, though, it was still a great card. You could steal your opponent's monster and then use it for a Tribute summon, which was great, or maybe you just needed to remove an opponent's monster to attack for game. You could do that with Change of Heart as well. So while it might not have been as broken as it would be nowadays in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, it was still a great card, and it makes sense that it was limited. Dark Hole and Raigeki were both limited at this time. They were super rares in LOB, but Dark Hole was also a common in starter deck Yugi and starter deck Kaiba, so Pretty much everyone back then had at least one copy of Dark Hole. Regeki was a little bit harder to come by, and it was more expensive, at least as far as I know, so more people had Dark Holes than they had Regekis. Still, back then, the cards were fairly similar. Dark Hole was obviously worse because it destroyed your own monsters as well, and that's pretty much remained true throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history, where Dark Hole has been a worse version of Regeki. There were plenty of formats where Dark Hole was legal, but Regeki was not. Yes, there have been some combo decks like Dinosaurs where people chose to use Dark Hole to destroy their own cards, where Regeki wouldn't have been able to do that, but for most of Yu-Gi-Oh's history, Regeki has been the better card. Still, at this point, you could only have one copy of each of them in your deck. Of course, Pot of Greed was limited at this time. This was before Graceful Charity was released, so this was the main draw spell in Yu-Gi-Oh! Back then, and yeah, even back in the day, Pot of Greed was crazy powerful, so it was definitely a card that deserved being limited. It's worth mentioning that back then, Pot of Greed was less good relative to how good it would be right now, though, because back then, when you were drawing all of those extra cards, a lot of the time you couldn't actually play them immediately, whereas nowadays, if you were to draw 2 free cards, you could probably play them and extend your combos. Back then, though, the big deal with Pot of Greed was the sheer amount of card advantage that it gave you, not so much that you would extend those cards into a bigger combo. So while it is true that Pot of Greed has gotten better with age, back then it was still a great card too. The final limited card of that ban list was Monster Reborn. This was a fantastic card back in the day, especially if you could revive a higher leveled monster like Summon Skull, for example. Overall, Monster Reborn has always been a pretty good card in Yu-Gi-Oh! It hasn't been super great recently, but for a long time it was the go-to revival spell for a lot of players and has seen tons of competitive play throughout the years. It was by far the easiest way to special summon a monster at that point. There was no setup required, there were no restrictions on what you could summon, and yeah, reviving big monsters without having to tribute for them was obviously a huge deal for old school players. Moving on to the semi-limited cards, we have Swords of Revealing Light. Now this card probably wouldn't have been that big of a deal, but at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh! We really did not have that many ways to remove back row, so if you were allowed to have a full 3 copies of Swords of Revealing Light in your deck, you might be able to stall out a ton of turns. There were ways to remove this card from the board. I'm not saying it was impossible to do, but we didn't have cards like Heavy Storm or Harpy's Feather Duster or MST at this point. So Swords of Revealing Light had to be semi-limited to prevent players from stalling out a bunch of turns, which would create a very unfun situation. The other semi-limited card was Card Destruction. Yes, Card Destruction was in the first couple releases in Yu-Gi-Oh! And while the discarding wasn't as relevant as it would be in the future because you weren't really triggering any graveyard effects because those didn't really exist at that point, it was still a great card to fix your hand and dig deeper into your deck. Having a full 3 copies of Card Destruction probably would have made decks way too consistent for that time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Anyway, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you later. Goodbye.